From MTN, the Montana Television Network, this is Face the State.
And good morning. Welcome to Face the State here on the Montana Television Network. We hope you are staying warm, a big challenge in Montana this winter. And we want to welcome to our program this morning Kurt Alme. Kurt is the U.S. Attorney for Montana, based here in Billings, but has authority over our entire state. We're going to pick his brain a little bit about the top challenges facing law enforcement in Montana. Kurt, thanks so much for joining us.
Jay, thanks for having me here. Appreciate having the chance to be here, especially now that you're an anchor emeritus. I'm glad I get to be here on one of your first shows, and thank you for 40 good years behind the microphone in Montana.
Well, thank you very much. Face the State was still part of my bailiwick, so we'll get to touch base with newsmakers like yourself on occasions. Just a little bit about Kurt Alme. He has been the U.S. Attorney for Montana, the District of Montana, for about a year and a half now. Prior to that, you might remember Kurt was the Director of the State Department of Revenue. He was also the Assistant U.S. Attorney not that long ago when Bill Mercer was the U.S. Attorney for Montana. So you've been involved in the law enforcement world, but prior to this most recent appointment to this job, you worked as the General Counsel for the Yellowstone Boys and Girls Ranch Foundation. You were President, and that's an interesting transition. I want you to tell us, first of all, how do you like your job, and how did you get from the Yellowstone Boys and Girls Ranch to our U.S. Attorney of Montana? It must be quite the journey.
It is. It's not as disjointed as you might think. I left the U.S. Attorney's Office in 2010 to go work at the Boys and Girls Ranch. You know, they have a very redeeming mission of working with kids, troubled kids, and trying to catch them when they're young and help them get on the right track. And I probably would have stayed there happily the rest of my career, but we started to see meth come back, and it started to come in from Mexico in high quantities, low prices, and it swept across the state. And we started to see that at the Boys and Girls Ranch several years ago. It was affecting our kids, it was affecting the foster care program, and then of course you look around the community and we saw it hit all sorts of places, from mental health to our medical facilities, to treatment facilities, our jails. It has become a major problem in Montana.
It's just overwhelming our systems, really, everything from families to court systems to public defenders to facilities like the Boys and Girls Ranch. So it was time for you to take a more active role in combating this crisis. That's what everyone's calling it.
Well, it is, and I don't think crisis is overstating it at all. And so, yeah, when I had the opportunity to come back to the U.S. Attorney's Office, I jumped at the chance, and it has been, they have such a great mission at the Department of Justice, and it fit in perfectly with trying to deal with meth, and also one of the biggest problems of meth, which is the related violent crime that we're seeing in Montana.
Before we get into the specifics, a little bit more about your background. You were a graduate from Custer County High School in Miles City, but I also read that you're a native of Great Falls. So is that both of those accurate?
Oh, there's more than that. Yeah, we made the rounds. Great Falls, and spent my childhood in Dillon and Victor over in the Bitterroot and Helena, and then finally made it over to Miles City, where my dad was the principal at Pine Hills.
Is that right?
Yeah, and did my high school years in Miles City and graduated there.
And you went to the University of Colorado and then the Harvard Law School.
Yeah, left the state for school and then came back and have been here ever since.
Amazing. So tell our viewers, because I'm not sure many people understand or realize what the U.S. Attorney for Montana does. So if you could give us kind of an overview of your job, a day in the life of Kurt Alme. Maybe.
You bet. Yeah, I'm not Tim Fox. I'm not the Attorney General for Montana. That confusion happens a lot. But there's a similarity where Tim is the Chief Law Enforcement Officer for the state of Montana. The U.S. Attorney is the Chief Federal Law Enforcement Officer for the state. So our office handles all federal criminal prosecutions in the state, as well as represents the United States in all of its civil actions, whether it's doing affirmative civil enforcement like healthcare fraud and cases related to opioids, or civil defense where the United States has been sued in a case, and we'll step in and represent the United States.
Do you actually get in court and argue cases anymore, or that's what the assistant U.S. attorneys are for?
You know, I haven't had much chance yet, but we're looking for more opportunities now that I'm starting to get settled in.
And you also, don't you have oversight over the U.S. Marshal Service as well here in Montana?
We don't have oversight over the other law enforcement agencies. The U.S. Marshal Service, the FBI, the DEA, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, we're all part of the Department of Justice.
I see.
So we all answer to the same management structure there.
And you just got a new boss. William Barr just confirmed as the new Attorney General in the United States. I asked you before we started the tape this morning, does the man at the top have any effect on you? Well, there was quite a void at the top for a while we transitioned from Jeff Sessions to William Barr. What's the answer there? Do you feel an impact of kind of some struggles at the top of the department?
You know, it really affects us in Montana just by the priorities that are set. So Jeff Sessions, when he was the Attorney General, set priorities, and now Bill Barr will set his priorities. We've already had a meeting with him, and he said his priorities are going to remain very similar to what we've been doing, which is violent crime and the opioid epidemic that's facing the United States.
I find it interesting that in the United States we have, you know, the legal system, equal justice for all under the law, and most people don't associate politics and the legal system together, but the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Attorney General is kind of setting the policy that is kind of where the two worlds mix. Is that?
Well, it is. It is, yeah. It's an executive branch agency, and so we all know the Attorney General and all the rest of the secretaries serve at the pleasure of the President, though with confirmation by the Senate also as a check and balance there. But yeah, United States attorneys, we're not popularly elected, we're appointed.
Appointed, yeah.
Appointed, so recommended by our Senate staff, and I was grateful for Senator Daines for recommending me and Senator Tester for his support, and obviously grateful for the President for the nomination and the Senate for the unanimous confirmation.
So a year and a half in, you still like your job?
Oh, I do. There's plenty of good work to do, Jay. Plenty of good work to do. You don't wake up in the morning wondering how you're going to spend your day.
Let's talk about this meth crisis that you alluded to right off the bat. It's really, our network just had a big series about the drug superhighway. As Montana is intersected by I-90 and I-15, we've got drugs coming in from the south. Maybe some of it flowing right through our state to the north. Canada seems to be a ripe new a market for methamphetamine. Kind of, if you will, bring us up to speed on that drug superhighway and what we're seeing in Montana.
You bet. And that article covered it, or that segment covered it very well. Again, it was not too long ago that we started to see literally an explosion of methamphetamine hit the United States and hit Montana. If you remember 10 years ago when we were battling methamphetamine, it was being cooked in people's bathtubs, right, locally. And we got that fairly well controlled and stomped out by the end of the decade. But about mid this decade, the Mexican cartels started to diversify into methamphetamine, and we saw super labs spring up along the northern border. And now well over 95% of our meth comes from the Mexican cartels. It is pure and it is cheap and it's flooding our markets. And just like you said, it's coming up through several corridors. The most common one is to California and either directly to Montana or hitting Washington and then coming across. But we're also a through state. You pointed out that there's demand for meth in Canada, and there's also demand for meth to the east. So we're also a flow-through state for methamphetamine.
Here we thought we had the meth crisis beat back down, back with the meth project in Montana. It seemed like the Bakken and the Bakken boom kind of fueled the resurgence of this drug. Is that a misnomer? Am I overstating that? Or?
Well, it was a target destination for some of the demand, but really it was driven by supply out of Mexico.
Okay.
Just massive amounts of meth being put across the border through the cartels that's flooding the United States. And so we were caught flat-footed, and with that price dropping like it did, it just spread like wildfire through the state. And we're seeing a host, as you know, of social consequences as well as public safety consequences.
So how do we combat it? I'm sure you've been brainstorming on this ever since your days at the Boys and Girls Ranch here, as you saw it on the front lines.
Yeah. So one of the major problems with meth is the violent crime that's coming with it. You know, we've seen a 35% increase in violent crime statewide since 2013. Just a remarkable increase. Law enforcement unanimously believes it's meth driven. And going with that, we're also now have the second highest violent crime rate in the Northwest in Montana. So what we're doing is we've teamed up with law enforcement partners across the state, Attorney General's Office, the County Attorneys Association, our federal law enforcement partners, state, local, tribal, and we are targeting people who traffic in methamphetamine, armed robbers who rob casinos and convenience stores to get money to buy meth to use or sell, and also violent felons who are illegally possessing firearms. And we've been aggressively going after those type of offenders in an effort to try to reduce violent crime, and particularly meth-driven violent crime.
Are we making any inroads?
Well, we think we are. You know, we've really been targeting the Yellowstone County and Missoula County areas because they've seen the most dramatic increases in violent crime and have the highest rates. We started Project Safe Neighborhood with all of our local law enforcement partners last April 1st in Yellowstone County, May 1st in Missoula County, and since then in both locations we've seen a drop-off in the increase of violent crime in Billings, and in Missoula we've actually seen a decrease compared to the previous year. But we can't just do this through enforcement. We've got to do this through prevention and treatment too. So the second part of Project Safe Neighborhood is trying to reduce demand. You know, enforcement's trying to reduce supply, but we're trying to reduce demand. So in both communities we're trying to support efforts that are trying to reduce through treatment and prevention demand for methamphetamine. In Yellowstone County, our group is called Yellowstone Connect, and it was a grassroots effort formed now by over 60 governmental and nonprofit organizations. We've been meeting for some time. We were able to secure a law enforcement grant of almost $360,000 that's gone to the Billings Police Department now and being administered through United Way. And we're on the verge of hiring a project manager as well as bringing in the consultants and expertise we need to do that sort of needs assessment, resource assessment, and then come up with a plan that's specific to Billings, specific to Yellowstone County, that's going to address violent crime demand reduction, as well as marry up with the efforts we're doing on the enforcement side to reduce supply. And we are optimistic we will make inroads. The other nice thing about it, of course, is we're not just thinking about Billings and Yellowstone County. We're trying to support similar effort in Missoula, but also trying to come up with a plan in Yellowstone County that would be replicable, that you could pick it up, move, and tailor to Flathead County, to Cascade County, to Butte-Silverbow. And maybe we can figure out the right recipe for a Montana-style crisis that we can try to get some of these problems reduced.
So you're partnering with all these other groups that are on the front lines, dealing with whatever tentacle of the meth crisis that they're dealing with. So it just seems to be overwhelming when you first look at it, when you attack it on a local basis on each of the local things, find out what works and brainstorm and then share that. It seems like we're making some inroads.
Well, that's what we think. We think that'll work. You know, we're not New York City, we're not Albuquerque, we're not Michigan, we're Billings, Montana, we're Missoula, Montana, we're Great Falls, Montana. And then let's not forget our Native American reservations, where meth is also a material issue and violent crime is going hand in hand with the meth problems there. We're also taking steps now to address the meth problem on our reservations in a way that's more effective and that hopefully will have the same violent crime reduction results.
The series that we did about the drug superhighway in Montana, I was amazed at how sophisticated. I mean, we talk about the Mexican drug cartels. These are very sophisticated criminals. I mean, and they showed the car, for instance, that had a special trapdoor in the back or a way you couldn't get into the car without knowing. And I was just, geez, if those people would just put their mind to legal endeavors, maybe they'd be really making some good money.
Yeah, we might be able to split the atom if that happened.
Exactly.
Yeah,
so
no,
we're dealing with. Must be just amazed at.
We're dealing with sophisticated, well-financed multinational corporations now, essentially operating in the form of a cartel, much more sophisticated than what we used to deal with, and law enforcement has to be more sophisticated. It's also more violent, though. When we get back to this issue of violence and this increase that we've seen statewide, one troubling trend is we're seeing more and anticipate more distribution of meth into Montana directly from cartel sources. And when that happens, we all expect to see a higher level of violence than we're used to in Montana.
And the way I understand, and talking to our reporter that did that series, she says, once you get to court, once you get into before the judge, you're very successful about getting convictions. But as you just described, it's so complicated. Getting into the court probably it's at the very last step of trying to put this jigsaw puzzle together.
We have tremendous law enforcement in this state and a lot of different angles that we're going after the drug problem. In fact, last year we formed a drug enforcement coordinating committee. For the first time, we had every federal, state, local, tribal law enforcement entity that does drug interdiction work meeting together in Helena, trying to be more effective about staying ahead of what the trends are, not just what drugs are being used, but what are the tactics being employed, how do we best address it, how do we coordinate, how do we deconflict cases, and how do we deal with new things, challenges of the internet, the dark web, mail. these new challenges and threats that are on the horizon, and hopefully we can keep at bay before they bring things like fentanyl and carafentanyl and some of those big elephants into the room that are significantly more dangerous and lethal than what we've seen so far.
If you're just joining us here on Face the State this morning, Kurt Alme, the U.S. Attorney for Montana, is our guest this hour, discussing his job and the big job of trying to get a handle on this meth crisis that is resurging across the state. Let's talk about opioids to begin with. Jeff Sessions was here, the Attorney General. How long ago? It seems like just a few months ago, but I'm sure it was longer than that.
Last April, I think, almost a year ago now.
But his whole focus was, you know, cracking down on, I guess, opioid distributors, and I guess, can you describe that to our viewers? Because that crisis is a little different, but it's something that Americans like their drugs. I'm sorry to say that, but those painkillers have really, they are addicting probably just as much as meth and some of the other terrible drugs.
You bet. So, first, just to quantify it, Jay, opioids aren't near the problem in Montana that meth is. Let's get it in levels of degree, but it's still a serious problem, and it's a growing one. So whether we're talking about prescription painkillers on the one hand, heroin, or fentanyl, we're talking about 3 different types of opioids here. Talking about the first one, prescription painkillers, that's the 3rd most available type of illegal drug in Montana behind meth and marijuana. But the good news, if there is good news in our conversation today, it's going to be that prescription painkiller use is tailing back a little bit in Montana.
We're learning a lot more about it.
We are, and I think the industries that regulate its distribution are being more responsible, are being more careful. Still, the #1 way that we get prescription pills out in the market in Montana is through doctor shopping, and right up there with prescription fraud. So I know prescribers are being more careful about who they prescribe to, about checking the physician, the drug registry, to see if this person is a drug shopper before they issue pills. So the things we can do to control that a little bit, and that's the good news. I think another thing too, don't let me lose this point. We have a drug take-back day coming up on April, I believe it's 27th, and DEA sponsors that around the state. It is a tremendous benefit to the community, and I'd encourage everyone who's listening to bring those extra bottles of pills with those extra Oxycontin or whatever you have down to the police department or wherever the drop sites are and get rid of them, get them destroyed, because SAMHSA tells us over half of new opioid users every year first get introduced to them through a friend or family member. So get those things out of your medicine cabinet and get them destroyed. Heroin is an up-and-comer. It's the 4th most common drug, and what's happening is because of the diminishing availability of prescription pills and also their increased cost, users are starting to shift over to heroin. So we're getting more demand for heroin, we're seeing more heroin. We saw a pretty significant increase in the last few years of heroin interdiction. That leads us to the 3rd one, which I've called again the elephant outside the room
fentanyl.
waiting to come in, and that's fentanyl, carafentanyl, other synthetic opioids that, you know, fentanyl is 50 times more potent than heroin. It's lethal to the touch. We've seen it's now the #1 killer of overdose, caused by overdose deaths in the United States. Thankfully, we haven't seen a lot of it in Montana yet, but we have seen some. We have got to be vigilant to keep fentanyl, carafentanyl, and these synthetic opioids out of the state.
See, and I hear that, and I'm thinking, okay, Prince died of fentanyl, Michael Jackson, and I just don't associate that with drugs that you're going to find on the street, but I'm hearing that is, in fact, not the case.
We've seen it in Montana, laced in heroin. We've seen it in pills that have been sold on the black market that look like oxycodone. But the #1 threat, without a doubt, is fentanyl coming in through the dark web. People going out on the dark web, ordering it from China or some other country, and have it delivered through the U.S. mail right to their doorstep. That is going to be a continuing concern as the drug distribution methods may start to shift towards away from a Sears and Roebuck style to more of an Amazon style where things are delivered right to your door.
And you mentioned the heroin, and we've seen the horror stories from some of the bigger cities, and as always, the problems seem to start on the 2 coasts and then go all the way across the country. And is that the case here? Because that you think, really, heroin? It seems like an old drug that we Remember back in the late 50s.
It is an old drug,
yeah.
but you know, they've transplanted it into Mexico now, and so we have cartels that are processing heroin, and now they're lacing it with fentanyl or replacing their heroin with synthetic opioids like fentanyl. And it's coming across the border just like the methamphetamine. So by almost all of the heroin we see here, just like the meth, is coming from Mexican cartels.
Let's talk about that other drug, marijuana. We're almost surrounded by states, or we might be very soon. And Canada has decided they're going to legalize marijuana to some extent. We've got
has legalized it. Yeah.
So where do we stand, and what kind of pickle does that put you in when we've got pretty much surrounded? I heard even Wyoming's considering it, which is surprising to me that Wyoming would go that route, but maybe that's the way they're going to choose. I'm not sure. What do you hear?
Well, from a law enforcement perspective, our role is actually pretty easy. Congress has put a budget rider on the budget bill called the Rohrabacher-Farr Amendment that says as long as someone using marijuana or distributing marijuana is in strict compliance with state medical marijuana law, we can't use resources, Department of Justice can't use resources to prosecute them. So as long as folks are in compliance with state law, there isn't a possible state or federal prosecution. Now, for those people who go beyond our very limited medical marijuana law and are selling it recreationally, are selling it to kids, are diverting it out of state, are doing other harmful consequences with it, they're not only subject to prosecution by the county attorneys, the attorney general, or our office, but any property that they use to further that illegal drug activity is subject to forfeiture.
Do you think eventually that's going to change as more and more states, it seems like the momentum to legalize marijuana seems to be gaining across the country, but not here?
You know, I don't know. I don't know what the tea leaves will show and what the voters will do and our congressional delegation will do. I guess we'll have to wait and see. I know North Dakota just defeated an amendment, or defeated an initiative that would have broadened marijuana into that state. So I guess we'll have to wait and see. I know we're starting to see more from Washington and Oregon and California and Colorado to see how their experiments are working out, and I guess we'll all learn from that experience.
You mentioned the Native American law enforcement issues and some of the terrible crises we have both with drugs and missing people and some of the unsolved mysteries or unsolved murders that are mysteries. And your office has some oversight in that area. Can you explain how that's going? Because those crimes are so horrendous, and we hear about these missing people, and it's like, well, what happened? I mean, sometimes it takes a long time for the missing person even to be alerted as missing.
Yeah, so first a little background for your viewers. The jurisdiction is not readily apparent, but just so everyone knows, 6 of the 7 reservations in Montana have retained their criminal jurisdiction. They haven't delegated to the state. Of course, on the Flathead, the Confederated Salish Kootenai have delegated their felony jurisdiction to the state. So we don't, we're not prosecuting crimes, or at least major crimes, coming off the Flathead. Now, the other 6 reservations, the tribes have retained their sovereignty, and so major crimes are investigated by the BIA and the FBI, and then they're referred to our office for prosecution. So we do have a greater role to play in those, on those 6 reservations than we do off those reservations. So we get to this very sad topic of missing and murdered Native American women and girls. It is a problem that needs to be addressed, and there's some good news on the horizon in that we're starting to see some tools become available that are going to allow us to better address it. You know, there's 3 different components roughly to this issue. One of them is trying to get good data. We don't have good data as to how many missing and murdered Native Americans or anyone else there is, because it's not a mandatory report for law enforcement to report missing adults. And that's on or off our Native American reservations. So one of the things that would help is if we have all law enforcement go ahead making those reports when someone's missing, as well as going out and clearing the report when the person's discovered. The Department of Justice has now put out a grant program, or headed out for a couple of years, called the Tribal Access Program, where we're giving grants to tribes that are interested in getting their tribal law enforcement to hook into the FBI's NCIC missing persons database, well actually the whole NCIC. So then tribal law enforcement can directly go out and input information about missing people and then also monitor cases of tribal members. So that's a good step. A second issue is protocols. If someone goes missing, which jurisdiction is supposed to receive the report? Which jurisdiction is supposed to go out and search, and under what circumstances? So those sort of protocols and guidelines, you know, you hope are in place. But one of the things that the Savannah's Act, which is being addressed at the congressional level right now, will do is instruct our office then to work collaboratively with all of our law enforcement partners and the tribes, victim groups, to try to come up with protocols that will hopefully allow things to be done more fluidly and make clear which jurisdictions have what responsibilities. A third issue, of course, is when someone's been missing for a while, we want to be sure that if there, as of today, if there are missing and murdered Native Americans or anyone else in Montana, we know who they are, and we be sure that those cases are sitting on some law enforcement's docket and those cases are getting worked. So trying to figure out a way, again, goes back to reporting and the data, to be sure that we have a list of every missing person so that we can be sure that case is getting actively investigated.
A lot of work to be done, but it looks like we are making some strides, so good luck with that. The final thing I have on my list, and our time is running short, about 2.5 minutes left, human trafficking and child pornography. I know Bill Mercer, when he was U.S. Attorney, that was one of their big focuses. And again, it's something that those of us in the mainstream of Montana are probably not thinking that it's a big thing here, but it is a big thing, and it's something most people like out of sight, out of mind, but how bad is it? Right,
and we do have human trafficking in Montana. Back in 2012, we started a statewide human trafficking task force of around 20 law enforcement agencies that have been working these kind of cases ever since. And I think there's been about 11 prosecutions since 2012 of human trafficking cases, so it's out there. Something to be aware of but this is an area where you really need help. Law enforcement needs help. If there are people out there watching, if you ever see signs of human trafficking, someone being kept against their will, be vigilant for it, immediately report it to law enforcement. And if there are individuals who are interested in helping work with victims of human trafficking, 5 of our communities in Montana have all created non-law enforcement human trafficking task forces to help provide services and to try to address the needs of human trafficking victims. So that's a way they can get involved. Now on child pornography, the internet hasn't gotten any smaller. Cell phones haven't gotten any less complicated. It's become a bigger and bigger issue. Just as the kind of child pornography receipt and distribution we used to see is just as prevalent, if not more. Some of the technological challenges for law enforcement, however, have gotten more significant as you try to interdict and identify these images. One area of concern is we think we're seeing more production in Montana. Now, not the wholesale production you hear about in Southeast Asia, but you know, parents or parents filming children, or somebody getting a child on a chat room and convincing them to film themselves doing a sexual act and then using that to extort them or eventually to lure them out of their home. So we are seeing a little bit more of that, and so I think it's worth a warning to everyone who's watching, especially everyone with kids. It's the same adage: know where your kids are, know who your kids are talking to, know what they're looking at, it's not it may be an intrusion into their privacy, but it's also absolutely necessary for their safety.
Well, I knew this time would go fast. I can't even believe we're over with, but Kurt, thank you so much.
Thanks,
You've
Jay.
got a big job ahead. Sounds like you're making some great strides, and we wish you the best of luck as you continue to be vigilant over the law enforcement.
Thanks, and I'm glad we got a chance to talk before you finally decided to go to Florida and hang it up permanently.
Got a few years before that happens.
Good.
Kurt Alme, our U.S. Attorney of Montana, joining us here on Face the State. Thanks again for joining us, and thank you for tuning in. We'll talk to you again soon.
You've been watching Face the State, a presentation of MTN, the Montana Television Network.